They'd even risk their lives for it.
A Sikh would die for the turban, without question. No turban, no Sikh.
Over the past 50 years, the turban has become a familiar sight on the streets of Britain. But to get a glimpse into its origins in Sikh history, we need to go back centuries and cross continents to Mughal India. The Sikh faith was founded in the 15th century by Guru Nanak. It was a time when India was fraught with religious division. Muslim against Hindu, caste against caste. But the Guru stressed the belief in one God and the equality of all.
The quality of the life of an average Indian in those days was very poor, and they were oppressed, they were tied into superstitions, there was religious persecution. So in that kind of an environment, Guru Nanak came with a message which was quite different.
In his very first sermon, he said, in God's eyes, there's neither Hindu nor Muslim. God isn't interested in our religious labels. God is interested in how we live. So it was a very, very progressive religion.
Whilst all the Sikh gurus wore the turban, it wasn't until 200 years after Guru Nanak that it became an established part of Sikh identity. It was under the leadership of the 10th Guru, Gobind Singh, that it was introduced for all Sikhs, not just as a symbol of holiness, but as an act of defiance. At the start of the 17th century, Gobind Singh's father, the 9th Guru, was executed by the Mughal emperor. His crime was defending the rights of all religions in the face of forced conversions to Islam. But it was from this tragic event that the Sikh turban was born.
At that time, Sikhs had no distinguishing symbols. And when the Mughals taunted Sikhs in the crowd to come and claim their master's body, people were scared to do so. So the 10th Guru, as he grew into maturity, he was only a boy at the time of his father's death, he determined that Sikhs would always be recognizable for their principles, and he gave us a uniform.
Gobind Singh decreed that Sikhs shouldn't cut their hair, and to protect it, they should wear a turban. It was a physical reminder of their faith, and a symbol that made all Sikhs equal and distinctive.
It was an extremely brave thing to do because at that time, non-Muslims were not allowed to wear a turban. So this is standing up to the might of the Mughal Empire to say, this is what we are and this is what we're going to be.
Since its origins in Mughal India, the turban has become an article of faith for Sikhs all over the world. And one that's still respected in Britain today. Turbans come in different colours, shapes and sizes, and they're important throughout a Sikh's life.
When a child reaches a certain age, there's a formal ceremony to tie the turban. And this is often done by the mother's brothers. And when a Sikh dies, he dies wearing a turban. So when he's cremated, he's actually wearing a turban.
For all Sikhs, however they choose to wear it, the turban is a key symbol of their religious identity.
My turban represents who I am. It makes me feel like I can conquer the world. It gives me a unique identity to stand out in front of many people.
Obviously, because immediately you look different, you've got to live by certain standards. I mean, you don't want to be swearing, you don't want to be doing bad things. So it encourages you to try to, stay on the right path.
The turban is our crown. It sits quite proudly on the top of our heads, and it says to the world, I am a sovereign, I'm an independent person, I am a Sikh.
Sikhs in Britain today are able to wear their turbans freely. But that's not always been the case. The story of the turban in this country is a turbulent one, in which Sikh courage and resolve has often been called upon. When the British ruled India in the 19th century, the turban would have been a common sight. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that it began to make its first appearances in Britain.
Clearly there were plenty of people from Britain in India who would have observed the turban there and have begun to have been familiar with it. But as far as in Britain itself, I think the immediate consciousness of the Sikh turban would have come about during the course of the First World War.
In 1914, British forces took a huge number of casualties fighting in France. The only army that could reinforce them, and that was as big and as well trained, was the British Indian Army. Indian troops took up their places on the Western Front. Although the Sikhs only made up 2% of India's population, they formed 10% of its army. Amongst the 1 million Indians fighting, 100,000 were Sikhs. And the turban was so important for them that in order to continue wearing it, they were prepared to put their own lives in danger.
Of course, there was always a problem with the turban and modern warfare. The moment we moved into the trenches in the First World War, tin hats were necessary for very, very obvious reasons. But the Sikhs said, we can't take off our turbans because our hair needs protection, and a tin hat with leather inside it is the last thing we are going to put on our heads. As far as we are concerned, these turbans are adequate protection for us. I think they regarded them as somewhat magical. It should keep the bullets away.
It was an act of defiance the army accepted and even encouraged.
You'd expect that there'd be pressure from the army for Sikhs not to wear a turban. In fact, it was the opposite. The last war that the British had fought in India was against the Sikhs, and it was very evenly balanced, the conflict, and the British just won. But they had huge respect for the fighting qualities and integrity of Sikhs. And when Sikhs were recruited into the armed services, the British would insist that they must wear a turban and the other symbols of their faith.
There were stories of British officers coming back and saying they saw Sikhs picking bullets out of their turbans. And one even said maybe all British officers should adopt the turban. So that's how effective it was.
20 years later, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the Sikhs once more came to Britain's aid.
England asks a question when danger's nigh. Will the sons of India your foes defy? Will we fight for England? Yes, until we die. That is India's reply.
And one of the first to join up was Mahinder Singh Puji, a Sikh pilot in the RAF. He passed away in 2010, but in his last interview, he revealed just how important his turban was to him when his plane was hit by a German fighter.
Black smoke from the engine started coming. Oil started coming out. At about 8,000 feet, I thought I wouldn't make it. And then I saw the white cliffs of Dover. So I was so happy about it and continued to glide. And I just crashed onto the ground. I was dragged out of the aircraft people saying, oh, he's still alive, he's still alive. I could hear them, but I had my eyes closed because of the fire. At that stage, my first concern was my turban. I just put my hands on my turban to see that it is still there. And my hands were full of blood. So there was a serious injury on at my head. And it made me feel at that time that perhaps turban has helped me.
In wartime London, such shows of bravery and loyalty touched British hearts.
I was treated as a very important person, VIP. That was especially because people here had never seen an Air Force officer with a turban. And wherever I went, they felt very sort of obliged. They said, oh, you're fighting for us. I stood in a queue trying to see the Gone with the Wind film. And when I went to the ticket counter, the girl there, she said, you don't have to buy a ticket, sir. You can go in. I wrote to my father, I says, no one could better place to die than a place here. See, because these are the people who love me and respect me.
Thousands of Sikhs like Pooji were injured or lost their lives in the 2 world wars. Their sacrifice gave the turban a special status in Britain.
During the Second World War and afterwards, the turban was seen as a symbol of loyalty to the British Empire, and the British showed respect for the turban because they surmised if someone is true to their faith, they will be true to the greater society and to the armed services.
This is the first time that the world-famous Sikhs have taken part in a tattoo in the United Kingdom. And tonight we in Edinburgh would wish to accord them a very warm welcome.
But once the threat of war had receded and the Sikhs were no longer crucial to Britain's military success, attitudes to the turban began to change. From the late 40s, Sikhs from India and East Africa began flocking to Britain to start a new life.
There were 2 reasons for such an influx of Sikhs or Indians. The first reason was Britain had just come out of the war and there was a labour shortage. So they invited people from former colonies, which included India, to come and help rebuild the country. So many Sikh men from the Punjab came to England to work in the foundries, the mills, the factories. And also we had the partition of India.
Delhi, the 15th of August 1947. The day when the British at last shed the burden and responsibility of India.
In 1947, India gained independence from Britain and was divided in 2. India and the new country of Pakistan. But the Punjab, the traditional home of most Sikhs, lay on the border and was split between them. Many Sikhs stranded in Muslim Pakistan fled.
They had to leave their homes. Some came and settled in places like Delhi. Others thought, here's an opportunity, let's go and see something of this mother country of ours.
The new arrivals made for London, the Midlands and West Yorkshire, where they often found work in textile mills or industry. For the first time, the turban was a common sight in British cities. But as the Sikhs put down roots, building gurdwaras and establishing their own communities, tensions rose. And it was precisely their appearance that singled them out.
They look different and they sound different, and their tastes in matters of food are different.
It was hostility to the fact that these folks didn't look like us, didn't behave like us, didn't have the same values as us, and were competing with us for scarce resources, and therefore we did not want them here. And the Sikhs were in some senses at the cutting edge of all of this, because their turbans made them plainly distinctive in religious and cultural terms, as well as in terms of their skin colour.
I think if they come to this country, they should be prepared to change and to live the way we do. In their dress and the way they talk.
Those that aren't prepared to accept our way of living, they're the ones that are going to get caught out.
After years of loyal Sikh service to Britain in the wars, where turbans were required uniform, it was a shock to find that now their turbans often prevented them from even getting jobs. Some British companies refused to employ Sikhs unless they agreed to stop wearing their turbans and cut their hair. Surjit Singh Uppal came to Britain in 1961 and, like many others, felt pressure to conform.
I wore the turban when I first came here till 1966. But as a worker, people would look at you, and I was always conscious. They're looking at me because I'm wearing a turban. And I thought this is what I presumed a hindrance to my future prospects.
So Surjit made a painful decision.
One day, it's sort of very reluctantly, my wife actually cut my hair, and she kept it for a while. I felt bare, something is missing. You lost something which is part of you. I would have loved to keep it.
Within a decade, the turban in Britain had been transformed from a symbol of loyalty to one of shame. But the Sikhs' warrior spirit hadn't deserted them. Manchester was the setting for the fight back. In 1957, a group of Sikhs decided enough was enough, and the unlikely arena for the battle was a double-decker bus.
In the late 50s, a gentleman by the name of Sundar Singh Sagar enrolled for a position as a bus conductor. Now, after completing his exams, he was told he would need to wear the regulation cap, and he refused. But Manchester Transport Corporation refused to back down, and they told him that if he wanted to work as a bus conductor, then he must remove his turban. And this led to an 8-year campaign.
Ujjal Didar Singh remembers his father's stand well.
My father said, I am prepared to wear a turban of the same colour and put a Manchester Transport badge on the turban, but I'm not prepared to take my turban off and wear a cap.
These regulations affected Sikhs elsewhere. Just down the M6, a similar case kicked off.
In Wolverhampton, a Sikh, Mr. Sandhu, who had previously been working on the buses, was ill. He went home, and when he returned from his sick leave, he had grown his beard and was wearing a turban.
When I got the job, I was not wearing turban. And in my mind, always I wasn't feeling comfortable because I was Sikh and I believe in my religion and I want to practice my faith. So I wore turban and went back to the bus. And when somebody told into the office that there's a Sikh person driving buses, so the superintendent came out to see me and he stopped me. He said, "You can't wear turban."
But we've got about 23 nationalities, and I couldn't count how many religions that we have to cater for. And those people, of course, who cannot comply with these regulations would probably have to find employment elsewhere.
So we're never likely to see a turban on a Wolverhampton bus?
It is most unlikely in the present circumstances.
Sikhs took to the streets in protest. But one man decided more drastic action was needed to defend the turban.
Mr. Jolly, he was an old, retired police officer. He thought, my God, I have served British peoples all my life, and now I'm hearing that in England you can't wear a turban. Then his feelings were hurt. So he approached me and he said, young man, this is what I heard. Is this your true feeling or is it just a laugh? I said, no, it's true feeling and this is what I want to be.
Mr. Jolly began to campaign for change.
It is a question of principle. If a cross is to the Christians, if I tell you take off your cross and throw it away, and how much you feel it. Similarly, those people who are working there, they are forced to take off their beard and turban. They are forced to throw away their faith.
But when his words fell on deaf ears, he made a radical threat.
When he said all these methods are exhausted, he declared, he said, if he's not allowed to wear a turban, I will burn myself to death.
Suddenly, the story was headline news.
If you have to die, Mr. Jolly, it's due to happen on Sunday. Are you not in any way frightened at all by the prospect?
Well, I am not frightened for nothing. I am not frightened for anything. This is, I shall find it my privilege to sacrifice for the Sikh community.
I said, well, you know, it was a shock to me in a way that somebody had want to die for me. He said, I'm not dying for you, I'm dying for the cause. It's not for you, it is the cause.
There was already a tradition of Sikhs making statements like that and carrying them out. And Sikhs felt that it would be a disgrace to their community if somebody made that sort of commitment and then didn't carry it through. So it was fully expected that he would give his life.
But at the 11th hour, disaster was averted. In the face of such pressure, the corporation backed down. Mr. Avtar Singh Azad became one of the first 2 Sikh bus drivers in Wolverhampton to wear a turban.
The manager, Mr. Butler, called us that he said the corporation changed the rules. We can wear the turban now. This is the turban, actually, the blue color we suggested. He supplied us the turban from the corporation. He gave us the free turban to wear on the buses.
It seemed to be a triumph for the turban. But the extreme tactics used by Mr. Jolly caused controversy, even amongst Sikhs themselves. In Manchester, the Sikhs had also had success, using diplomatic means.
My father didn't agree with any form of threatening behaviour to achieve his goals, because he was a great believer in following procedure and political lines. His feeling was that the threats might actually alienate the local communities against the Sikhs, and that the Sikhs may seem to be radical people, which obviously we're not.
And in Wolverhampton, such fears were proved right.
The public were dismayed. They were dismayed that there should have been what seemed to be a climb down at gunpoint. I mean, with the fear that somebody was going to become a martyr. And so they expressed their indignation in letters to the press. That doesn't mean that they were all hostile to Sikhs as such or to the turban, but they certainly felt that this was no way for issues to be resolved responsibly.
It was 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Wolverhampton bus drivers were wearing the turban, but Jolly's suicide threat was a public relations failure. The fight to wear the turban without provoking hostility was far from over. It was in the 1970s that the turban hit the headlines again, in another transport-related conflict.
Get your motor running. Head out on the highway.
This is the famous bike purchased by my father in 1973. It's a little bit worse for wear, but it's quite a famous bike, has a very unique history.
In June 1973, it became illegal to ride a motorcycle without wearing a helmet. It was a law which transformed all turban-wearing motorcyclists from harmless bikers into criminals.
Dr. Sikh is an honest, law-abiding man. Don't give me all that rubbish about him being a law-abiding citizen. I mean, look at him now, look, he's riding that bike without a crash helmet. Sikh!
Biking Sikhs all over the country rode into trouble.
Born to be wild.
I know it is an offence to ride a motorcycle without a crash helmet, and you'll be reported for that offence.
One of the lawbreakers was Sundar Singh Sagar.
My father rode this motorcycle on the streets of Manchester and picked up a string of violations and was then taken before the magistrates and fined. And he was told that if he didn't pay his fine, he would go to prison. And eventually he was sent to prison for a week. Upon his release, myself and quite a number of the community members met at the doors of Strangeways prison. There was a loud cheer, and he was adorned by garlands. And we had his motorcycle ready, and he mounted his motorcycle in front of the Strangeways gates and proceeded to drive down Bury New Road. And in the short distance of about 1 kilometre, I think he was given traffic violation tickets, I think on 7 or 8 occasions.
It was the determination of men like Ujjal's father that finally led, in 1976, to an act being passed exempting turban wearers from having to use a helmet. But this time, the turban's triumph had been achieved without alienating the public, and it had raised awareness of just how important the turban was for Sikhs. But the right of Sikhs to wear the turban everywhere and anywhere without discrimination was still not protected by law. It was a case in the 1980s that finally changed everything. The turban was about to make legal history. This time, it was one of Birmingham's best independent schools that decided the turban was not for them. In 1978, 12-year-old Gurinder Singh Mandla had made his father proud by winning himself a place. But following a now familiar pattern, there was a catch. The headmaster took exception to Gurinder's turban.
The choice was either I go to the school and cut my hair or not go to the school at all. And for me, it was never a decision. I was never going to go to that school without my turban. My turban's part of me. It's like my right arm.
Gurinder's father, Seva Singh Mandla, was a lawyer, and he decided to take matters further.
I felt very aggrieved. And I said, look here, if we compromise my faith, then my son will not grow up as a strong person, because I believe faith gives you strength. And then the only course left for me then was to seek recourse to the courts, because clearly I was being discriminated against.
Mr. Mandla began court proceedings. It was a course of action that would bring the turban to the forefront of the best legal minds in the land. Roger Ballard was called as an expert witness.
The Race Relations Act had recently come in, and so Mr. Mandla sued the school on the grounds that it was discriminating against his son, strictly on racial grounds. The Mandlas argued quite straightforwardly that the Sikhs were an ethnic group in terms of the Act, and that refusing Mr. Mandla's son a place at the school was contrary to the Race Relations Act.
But much to the Mandlas' dismay, they lost the case. Not once, but twice. In the county court and the Court of Appeal.
I was surprised by it
living in a multiracial society that people like that are closing doors on people like us.
Sikhs could now be discriminated in very vital fields like education, housing, employment.
The outlook was bleak, but the Mandalas weren't about to give up. And there was only one place left that could reverse the verdict: the House of Lords. The Lords were faced with a decision. Were the Sikhs a religious sect, in which case they weren't protected by the Race Relations Act, or a national, ethnic or racial group, in which case they were?
Quite clearly the Sikhs were not a race in a biological sense. Nor were they a national group, because there was no Sikh nation. So Mr. Mandla's solicitors were right in suggesting that the Sikhs were an ethnic group. The House of Lords, in their wisdom, they decided that an ethnic group was a body of people with a long shared history, a consciousness of their distinctiveness, and a commitment to keeping that distinctiveness within the community alive. And therefore the school had indeed discriminated against Mr. Mandla's son on racial grounds.
Five law lords have ruled that a Birmingham headmaster broke the law by refusing to allow a Sikh boy to wear a turban for school.